scale back and talk about Wildlands Network. Well, I kind of have a unique experience that with the PhD, I'm working for an NGO and I'm still getting to do research. I think I didn't know that that really existed necessarily. I was thinking state agency, academia, and instead I've been working for Wildlands Network. Wildlands Network started in the 1990s with a focus on large landscape conservation, essentially writing the book. Then we were called Wildlands Project on continental conservation. And in the 1990s, this was, this wasn't, folks weren't really behind this. They thought this was a little bit radical. And currently down there, the map here showing our wildways is showing where all of us at Wildlands Network work. So we're based, our main office is in Salt Lake City, and we've identified these wildways, these large areas that we think connected and protected landscapes are going to help with biodiversity conservation. And then I, of course, am being the senior wildlife biologist. I have the Appalachian region is my jurisdiction. I'm mostly focused in the Southern Appalachians and the Central Appalachians. And here I'm showing a poster where we do mapping as a science-based organization, has a big focus in policy. We use a lot of our mapping and other folks' tools. Think about the Nature Conservancy's resiliency or climate adaptation mapping. We use those that identify important conservation areas, be it habitats, rare species, and we look at potential connectivity and corridors between these large protected lands. So we kind of call these large protected lands cores. We identify those. That's what's in that green color. And then the yellows and corridors. So we actually have maps that we use for research science. This is really just a visualization, what an inspiration of what a connected eastern landscape could look like. Bear with me now. I seem to not be able to advance. Okay, maybe I'll try space bar. So connectivity is a conservation priority. It sounds like maybe you guys learned a little more about that last week, but we know now in the 90s, maybe it wasn't exactly folks' focus, nor did they believe that large landscape connectivity was really this important thing, but we now know that improving connectivity between protected areas is vital for the effective conservation and management of biodiversity. Connectivity facilitates ecological and evolutionary processes. We consider a fragmented landscape, wildlife having barriers and not being able to access food, mates. Also, without this genetic exchange of information, we have isolated populations. And with the climate change and the things we're against these days, those populations are more vulnerable to localized extinctions. And really, the big significance of the Appalachian Mountain region, even here in the Piedmont and South Carolina, if we look at the Nature Conservancy's migrations in motion, where they've done some predictive mapping of where birds, amphibians, and mammals are going to be moving to ameliorate the effects of climate change, we know they're going to be moving northward. And if you can see here, we have a huge bottleneck here in our region, the Southern Appalachians and in the Southeast. And so that makes it imperative that we focus large landscape conservation and connectivity here in the East. We have a really important opportunity to improve biodiversity and conservation. And again, because of these climate and environmental changes, human development, we have this increasingly fragmented landscape. And now we know, what we're calling road ecology, looking at organisms and wildlife movements around roadways to try to understand, how they interact. We do that research now because we know roads disrupt ecological processes. Again, everything I just mentioned about a fragmented landscape. We look at this roadway here. Sure, there's some wildlife that can get across, but with a lot of traffic, some of these organisms aren't getting across, right? Or if there's resources on the other side. A really important example of this is like bears in the mountains. So in the fall, we see an increase in road mortality of bears in the fall. And this is because in years of acorn mass failures, when we have low acorn crops, we see bears moving more to find these resources. It's just kind of a nice take home that when acorn mass is less, bears are moving more, we see more bears killed on the roadway. We have a lot of examples like that, but I think that's kind of an important one. So we know roads now disrupt these ecological processes, especially these large interstate highways. And we know there are solutions. We don't see this much in the East, but in the West and in European countries, wildlife crossings have been being used for a few decades now, especially out West. And I'm sure folks have seen it on social media. It's got a kind of a lot of hype now to have wildlife crossings. But this is a real solution to increase the connectivity, reduce wildlife vehicle mortality on the roadway. And there's a whole baked in human safety component to this as well. And that's how we kind of get our interact with our DOTs because of wildlife vehicle collisions causing human safety issues. But again, to understand where to put these sorts of wildlife crossings or how to mitigate the wildlife road conflict issue, we need research to identify, where these go. We need to understand where are animals trying to cross, where is this functional connectivity. And so that brings us to talking about the project I've been working on for the last 4 years, dubbed the Pigeon River Gorge Connectivity Project. And so where we're focused at, and I wonder if a lot of folks have driven this part of Interstate 40, got Great Smoky Mountains National Park here in blue. It's both in Tennessee and North Carolina. You can see the Appalachian Trail here. And we've delineated a 28-mile section of Interstate 40. And as you can see, we have protected lands on both sides of the interstate. So we have Great Smoky Mountains National Park in blue, and we have our Pisgah and Cherokee National Forest in the green there. This is a busy section of Interstate 40, so it's connecting Asheville to Knoxville. And then we know that there's a severity of bear, deer, and elk vehicle collisions in this area. But also in the grand scheme, while we focus on these large charismatic mammals, we are using them kind of as a proxy to understand where these important connectivity areas are, because the diversity of both of these places is important. And I think everyone can understand that connecting these two landscapes with protected lands that have this enormous interstate running through there. Has anyone driven through this area? There's a double tunnel, usually white knuckling, the steering wheel trying to get through here. And so beyond just these vehicle collisions, the human safety thing is really a potential barrier for wildlife movement. And that's what we're wanting to investigate further. So this has ended up being a really collaborative project, the Pigeon River Gorge project. So early on in 2018, Wildlands Network we used some more donor-funded money to get GPS collars for elk. In talking about this project to the State Wildlife Agency, the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, and Great Smoky Mountain National Park, we started building a coalition of folks. First, we got everybody in the room in the fall of 2018, not-for-profit NGOs focused on conservation, the North Carolina and Tennessee Departments of Transportation, the wildlife agencies, and the federal agencies to talk about this issue and see if folks would support our research project. And so I can say that the National Park and the State Wildlife Agency helped us, and the Departments of Transportation helped us collect data for our research project. And through all of this collaboration, we now have a coalition called the Safe Passage, I-40 Pigeon River Gorge Wildlife Crossing Project. So we have a lot of NGO public support. We're trying to work with the state agencies and the Resource Commission to understand the issues here and provide research that can move us forward. When we talk to these state agencies, they'll say, we're a data-driven agency. We need to see the information to make movement forward. And so the 3 years of it, about a year post this project, we put out our research findings in June 2022. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be rolling out this entire, there's so many great tidbits of information, and we had a multifaceted research approach. So what I'm not going to be focusing on today is that we did driving surveys for roadkill, we got roadkill information, wildlife vehicle collision information from state troopers. And we use that information, divided up the roadway to try to identify what we call hotspots, where we have high amounts of wildlife vehicle collisions. Then also another facet of road ecology is monitoring, what you guys can see. Monitoring structures that already exist under the interstate. So there's culverts, bridges that both vehicles use and to transport water under the interstate. And large structures like this in road ecology, we tend to monitor those to see if, how permeable, called permeability, how permeable is the roadway? Are wildlife using some of these structures under the road? And we also did a camera trapping in segments adjacent to the roadway and using wildlife detections of bear, deer, and elk as a proxy for animal activity adjacent to the road. So we have all these background pieces of identifying wildlife vehicle collision hotspots. Are wildlife using the large structures under the roadway? How permeable is it? And just trying to get ideas of animal activity adjacent to the road. And so we put all that together and roll out that information. But what I'm going to focus on today is our chapter 2 of this research report, which is using elk GPS color data to understand elk road conflict areas on I-40, as well as doing some predictive mapping. So the objectives with the elk GPS color monitoring is to collect elk locations. So we call it elk in 2018, collected locations till 2020. And we have an hour GPS fixed rate. So we're collecting a location every hour. And we want to identify elk I-40 conflict areas. So we want to identify crossing locations. And we want to look at if there's a potential barrier effect. Areas where elk aren't crossing, but they're using areas close to the roadway. And then what I'm really going to dive into, and hopefully, I can keep it interesting and not too muddled down, is creating a predictive model and identifying road locations where elk movement probability is more likely. And you understand why we had to focus on this so much here in a little bit. So just real quick, before I dive in, elk in Appalachia. So the map here showing when eastern elk vanished from their range. So eastern elk were a specific subspecies of elk. This is a depiction of an eastern elk by Audubon. And so as you can see, elk were all over the southeast. But now we only have a few populations, and they've all been reintroduced populations. So the population in Great Smoky Mountains National Park was reintroduced in 2001 and 2002 to the Cataloochee Valley in the park. This is an open grassland. And it's important to remember that my master's work at Western Carolina University was on elk. And it was interesting, I was doing a post-tenure study. For me, being a Midwesterner, the corn and soybean fields of Illinois, and knowing of overpopulations of white-tailed deer, I was curious in my master's why ungulate, like an elk, would be put in like a very florally diverse park. I kind of got to that by looking at what habitats they were selecting and their diet. And the reality is why elk have a really plastic diet, right? They are browsers, they do browse, they can graze. Every year, seasonally, the largest component of elk diets in the Smokies was grasses, right? So they're keying in on these grasses, they're ruminants, right? They have this relationship. Also found that the Great Smokies Mountains National Park is 99% forested. So if they're keying in on these grass areas, they move out of the park pretty quickly. And in the park, they're kind of selecting the youngest forests there, which are really just old settlements as the park was abandoned. So just kind of interesting, forestry, kind of vegetation habitat. The population right now is, they're estimating 225. 10 years ago in my master's, the estimation was 250. So it's going down. There's a big demographic study going on with the elk at the University of Tennessee. So there'll be more information about the population, but there are other eastern populations that have been reintroduced. So Kentucky has their own population, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And it's important to note what's made this job so much harder, and why I'm going to have to dive into the research here, is these elk don't migrate. So out west, the other senior wildlife biologist, does pronghorn elk movement in New Mexico. It gets to have these long note, like winter, summer ranges, and those are very defined. The elk here, they don't migrate, right? And that's because food's available all year round. They don't need to move to find food. But they do have some exploratory movements, as we know the population hasn't been here that long. And so we get some really interesting exploratory movements. And of course, the elk are both in and outside of the park at this point. And they are getting hit by vehicles, both on the interstate and beyond. And those vehicle collisions are very severe. So we've got to reintroduce population, put a lot of money into, want to see that population grow. At the same time, vehicle collisions are an issue. And then the severity of vehicle collisions do have the DOTs and human safety folks perk up. And so this is we're kind of coalescing, collaborating around these elk, both for them as a proxy for connectivity in the gorge. There's some winners and losers there, but also this human safety component as driving along interstate and coming across a 1,000-pound animal just isn't safe. So to go through some methods real quick, I mentioned our study area is this 28-mile section of Interstate 40. And so to create a spatial reference or scale, I don't think this comes out very well, divided the roadway into 400-meter segments. That's what we attached our vehicle collision data to. That's where we looked at and spatially looked at animals using these other structures under the road. And so we end up with 115 segments. And that won't be too important for now, but then we apply a lot of our elk movement data to then these segments so we can have the spatial reference. And so again, in 2018, with partnership and collaboration with the National Park Service and the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, we got 13 elk collared. And so we fitted these elk with GPS collars that have iridium satellite communication. These are Vextronics collars. Just to clean up the data, to put that out there for anybody else doing research like this, we removed all 2D fixes. Again, these are kind of dealing with how the satellite communication is and how accurate we think these locations are. So we want to clean up that data. We retained all the 3D fixes with DOP values less than 7. Again, a measure of response and angles of satellites. We ended up with 123,606 elk locations, about 9,000 average locations per individual. One of them only had 400 locations. And on average, the days we monitored them were about 400 to 450. And so as you can see, our elk were really spread out. We had one of our elk early on. Maybe it's headed down here. Took off pretty early in an exploratory movement, got hit by a vehicle near Andrews, near the airport Andrews. We also had not one of our elk, but an elk killed in the Pigeon River Gorge. So you can see the outline of the study area here in yellow and all of our elk movements. I'll note that where the elk were released in one of their main areas is the Cataloochee Valley, here where my cursor is. So we see a lot of movement there. And again, we're really just focusing on the elk here on the Pigeon River Gorge roadway. And so when we just look at the data I mentioned, we want to identify where they're crossing the road using our divided up segments, but also where they're kind of using the road but not crossing. And that gives us 3 animals. So, this is good information. It's a little anecdotal. What's pretty wild is this one elk. I've never been a person that gives the collared animals like a fun name, and I really wish I would have. I started calling her our I-40 cow. So for the 2 years we had her collared, and she was known to be making movements like this. She crossed the interstate 107 times. And what's interesting is she's probably doing this right about now. She leaves the Cataloochee Valley every spring, and the cows leave to go have their offspring in a secluded, isolated place. And she just happened to choose hers to be on the other side of the interstate. More interesting is she was pretty smart and she ended up using the Appalachian Trail crossing. This is where this Green River Road crosses. The AT comes down and she uses that bridge. Here you can see her with her calf. These are the AT trailblazers right there too. So she's using this structure. We caught her at our other cameras, other years, moving her calf. So this one animal crossed 107 times. At that crossing structure, I mentioned this bridge where the interstate goes over it, but also at road grade, where the slopes are kind of conducive. She can see across, but she crosses multiple times at road grade as well. The other two animals, so again, 3 elk that kind of interacted with our study area across the roadway, 2 elks that approached but did not cross. And so this looks at kind of a barrier effect. But so we tabulate the crossing locations and the number of elk locations within these buffers and attach those to our 115 road segments, right? So say the elk crossing is azimetric, elk use along the adjacent roadway as another identifying elk use of the interstate. But then this is where things got a little complicated is we can't really use these 3 animals to infer what the whole population is, where these elk are going to cross the interstate as their population grows, or as Pisgah National Forest's 12-mile project, one of the largest habitat projects in Pisgah National Forest. It's actually on both sides of the interstate, and they're going to be creating a young forest habitat for elk. And I'll say the herbaceous vegetation is such a draw for elk that often looking at my GPS data, wondering why elk's spending so much time in an area and going and checking it out, it might be because they're cutting a path for a cell tower. So that's how much they key in on this younger forest habitat or cutovers. But again, 3 animals, and then just trying to look at, this is the step length between each our elk location, and these are all of our individual animals. I've got the female and male, just some exploratory information trying to understand, well, shoot, the big deal is elk really don't move that much in an hour, right? And because we can't really infer what is movement here. And so the idea is needing to classify when elk are moving, when they're resting, and when they're foraging. So using a hidden Markov model, so this takes the step length between locations and the turn angle, and using this move HMM package in R, identifying behavior states, resting, the foraging, and the moving. So just showing how this is modeled, mostly for things that being identified as a moving phase or state or step, looking at almost 0 turn angles, so direct movement forward and larger step lengths. Whereas foraging has more extreme movements and angles, smaller step lengths, and the resting phase being pretty much no movement, very short step lengths. And so able to then classify these elk steps and locations as moving, foraging, or resting. And that's kind of what this is the number of elk locations in our data set, and then what behavior they fall into. And so for the next step in analysis, we're just using these elk identified steps, identified as movement steps from the model. And so taking these movement steps, now we're going to be able to create a model that looks at how elk select resources as they're moving through the landscape. And so again, these movement steps are consecutive elk locations with 60-minute time intervals. Each step's paired with 9 random steps. Following the literature here, based on step selection function for movement step with Singer et al. In 2019. So those step lengths have a gamma distribution, the turn angles randomized. And then we extracted 12 explanatory variables from GIS data. Stuff we knew, impacts elk movement from herbaceous vegetation, forest cover, elevation slope aspect. I didn't go into this, but here we dropped highly correlated variables. So in our mountains, the rough, rugged areas tend to be forested, right? And then we tend to have our roadways, human development, hay pasture, a lot of these things are all correlated. So those got pulled out. And the variables used are all here. Ended up using 9 different explanatory variables. I mentioned some of those. And just want to mention, I don't have this here, but because there's potential edge effects, right? If elk are, they need forest cover sometimes, but they also need like herbaceous cover. But also when we're looking at impacts of roads, that's a linear feature. And so often, you know, in this schematic where we have elk location, and then normally for a resource selection function, you're delineating a home range or you have a study area. You have your animal locations and you're generating random points or what's available on the landscape. And here we're doing that with the step selection function. So we're not using these home range defined areas. We're actually, we have where the elk moved, so a used location. And then we are, again, like I said, pairing that, here there's only a few examples, but we're pairing that with 9 locations that they could have moved in. We're extracting our GIS data from those locations. And to explain better, the distance to in meters to forest, herbaceous, open water, shrub, major road, and minor road, because there's likely edge effects. So if we're doing distance to, instead of just a categorical extraction of what that point ends up being. And so then using a generalized linear mixed model. So essentially a conditional logistic regression. So in contrast, those explanatory variables of the availability, the paired steps, the available steps, the way L could have went with the use domain was true steps. And then we're just developing models using all combinations of variables and using elk ID, so individual elk as a random intercept, different sample sizes, and accounting for potential autocorrelation there. So again, a generalized linear mixed model where the random intercept is elk ID, and then really using the straightforward top model identification with differences in Aki-Iki information criterion for small sample size. And then following parsimony rules, and also did some k-fold cross-validation estimate of accuracy for the top model to see it kind of fits in these generic parameters to like identify further. I'll say that this model isn't, we'd have to do more to do like extrapolating predictive. This is really just ranking what resources are important for elk movement. And so our top model ended up having 8 of the 9 variables we ended up using. And I'm just highlighting here the significance of all of the variables end up being significant in the model, but these are standardized coefficients. So showing the direction and weight of the variables in the top model. And as you can see, slope is the main driver in this model. Really, is driving that 2 to 3 times more so than other variables, but also herbaceous vegetation is up there too. So we lower slopes, more flat slopes. It's kind of hard to talk about slopes sometimes. And then elk are moving through areas closer to herbaceous vegetation. Remember, since this is for distance variables, the negative implies closer distances. But we do see elk are moving in areas, farther away from shrub and forest cover, and as well as farther from major roads, but closer to minor roads. I don't do the best job of breaking this down in the next slide, so it makes sense that elk are potentially using minor road areas because this is where we have open areas and vegetation. Major roads being, potential barriers. They're loud. They're in the major roads in the Smokies in this area are kind of in more rugged terrain. shrub cover, forest cover, not as easy to move through. Aspect and elevation, I think are just kind of specific to elk, choosing these kind of higher elevations in the area, as well as like aspect had pretty minimal impact. But for the most part, slope and herbaceous vegetation are driving how elk are moving through the landscape, where these resources are. And so to take that further, now we have a model that identifies resources and how they're influencing elk movement. We want to create a predictive movement surface. So taking the unstandardized beta coefficients that I just showed in the last, we're taking each beta coefficient, it's getting multiplied by that raster cells information, and then added to then those other variables, kind of a quick and dirty of explaining this. So essentially creating elk movement surface based on this equation here. And then we inversed that movement surface to create a resistance surface. And then working with our GIS specialist at Wildlands Network, Alex Vanko, we put together a connectivity model using Omniscape. So that includes circuit theory to simulate predictive movement, like current through a landscape, but it's elk movements based on the model in the inverse raster. And so we end up with a cumulative current map. And so as you can see, that's just the base of this map. And what we do is, sure, this is in my, okay. So we calculated the average cumulative current or connectivity value within our 200 meters buffered roadway segments. We identified those segments with higher than average connectivity values. So you can see those here. And then segments, these then would be segments that are potentially important for elk functional connectivity and thus potential locations for road mitigation. So we take where we know elk are crossing, where we know elk are interacting with the roadway, and then we have our predictive elk movement model that helps us look at, as this population grows or beyond these 3 individuals that we know are here, where are the likely movement paths? We know that biologically all these variables tend to make sense, especially as elk are path of least resistance movers. My time at Western Carolina, trying to get at what forest types elk were selecting. VHF at the time didn't work in the valley, so I was mapping these elk, what I call like cow paths through the forest. They all tend to create these pathways, and you know that elk are going to take saddles through the landscape. We see this both in western and eastern populations. So identifying these lower slope areas, but taking that elk information and then adding it to the information from chapter 1 that I mentioned, where these are our 400-meter road segments, color coded as being like, this would be a hotspot with vehicle mortality, more than 6 vehicle mortalities during our study area. And then of course our information of if animals are using the current crossings. And so putting all this information together in our 115 road segments to again identify potential mitigation opportunities or where wildlife we're trying to get across the road. And so our chapter 3 in the report really identifies the research information and how those locations would be better or could be improved for wildlife connectivity, and also like really pushing for some wildlife dedicated overpasses. So we are still currently working with the state agencies, both the DOT and the Resource Commission, to prioritize road mitigation in the Pigeon River Gorge and really push them to apply for federal funding to support wildlife crossing structures. Where working for an NGO gets different is I'm in my advocacy phase now. So we're pushing hard. We have a lot of meetings with both of these groups, so they supported our research. The cost of wildlife overpasses in the millions of dollars, and that framework not really existing here in the East, and maybe politics and funding be a little different. we're really in a fight here. What's exciting is the governor in North Carolina, Governor Cooper, did just put $5 million in for wildlife specific infrastructure. That has to pass the opposite parties, the Democrat, the Republicans, to get that through. But you know, we have a large coalition behind us. We're trying to meet the agencies both ways, and there's a lot of available funding. You know, recently $350 million in federal funding for wildlife crossings, and funding in the infrastructure bill. One of our big wins, showing the snippet here, is really when we were starting this research, the DOTs told us they were replacing 5 of the bridges in our study area. We were able to just give pretty simple guidance on how they could improve by replacing these structures, how they can improve wildlife passage. And they really got on board with that. This has been probably our strongest part of the partnership. And so Harmon Den, in our study area, a bridge that has a road crossing under it, as well as an important waterway, they made the bridge span longer so that there's more space under the bridge for wildlife to move along it. Also incorporating fencing, guide fencing, and then any guide fencing with ungulates, you also have to have jump out structures in case animals get stuck in that area. So it's quite complicated, but important to say, wildlife structures and mitigation, it all has to be paired with fencing, which is also quite expensive. Usually for a structure, it's recommended 1.5 to 3 miles of fencing. That's both to guide animals to the structure, but it's really to exclude them off the roadway. The Harmon Den Bridge and replacement is completed now, and it's gotten a lot of good press. And you know, they're still to put the fencing in, but there's 4 other bridges that are being replaced that they're modifying for wildlife. And then just I'm about to finish up here, but just want to talk about elk GPS data and future research. So next step, this study really was supposed to encompass, and it does encompass I-40 and US 19, the southern border of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But our coalition focused on the Pigeon River Gorge. We're going to be going back and focusing on US 19, the Blue Ridge Parkway, trying to partner with the Eastern Band of Cherokee, their Dr. Caleb Hickman, who's their wildlife biologist there, to look at potential crossings. You know, Blue Ridge Parkway is kind of seen as a potential barrier for elk, you know, the koala boundary. And this is where on US 19, where we're seeing the majority of elk vehicle collisions. So refocus there. Also, wanting to take the information we learned here, you know, standardize the data and use that to look at how elk populations in Appalachia might be connected, how they would likely movement paths they might actually go. And then really exciting why I was invited today was working with Dr. Chakowski, the students starting, I believe, in August, looking at potential movement corridors into South Carolina, have a lot of data from the Resource Commission, we have a data sharing agreement. So beyond this elk GPS data, a lot of other elk GPS data, and wanting to look at potential elk habitat in South Carolina. We're still kind of developing that. So that's kind of a fun next step. So you know, we'll be doing some elk research here in the future. And then just a big take home that this road ecology work has been really fulfilling and fun because it's truly applied research to be used on the ground to really move conservation forward. A lot of work goes into it, but knowing there's actual solutions, and in my lifetime, I could see some changes has been really motivating. And again, you know, we're sitting here in the bottleneck of important places for wildlife to move to mitigate climate change. And so our focus of protecting lands and connectivity is really important for here. I want a special thanks to, you know, a lot, we, as wildlands, mostly have private funds. And so I'll always thanking our private donors and foundations that support us, and these other agencies I kind of mentioned before. And with that, I can take any questions, and I'm happy to talk during lunch as well. Yeah.
So So the model you made was based on just the traits of the areas that the algal movement occurred. But only 3 of your 13 ever like even approach
Right.
a road. So was that specifically a factor in you figuring out frequency of crossing? Or was it purely based on like the slow urbanishness, et cetera, of where they were walking?
Right, the predictive movement model is based on GPS, the movement GPS data from all 13 animals.
And then so just where it happened, so where the traits around the road happened, that where they were walking, that's how you would decide if it was more or less likely that and cross that section of our road.
Right, so you kind of, from those variables in the model, you create a surface and then, almost like a hot to cold map of priority of movement, of how those resources impact movement. But then taking the inverse of that, so it's a cost surface, so it's actually showing the barriers where it wouldn't go, and running that concurrent omniscape model to kind of figure out where flow would happen with that resistance surface.
And for the Harden Bridge, so I'm just a little confused. So it's a bridge, but in the center of it, like between the lanes, there's a wildlife corridor. Or is it underneath? I just couldn't tell.
Yeah, so it's kind of like just a typical bridge, and when they replace that bridge, they make it span longer. And so that just allows for more space. So it's not, by no means is it a wildlife dedicated, it is a multi-use structure. But yeah, it just creates more space. Before the span of the bridge, the piers give no space, and then they're often filled with dirt or fill. So it's just this one space, 2 roads go across. So just low hanging fruit, and what we could get, these plans were already out. They made the bridge span larger, so there's actual areas for wildlife to move along the roadway.
And then they go on like the bridge, like the part where people still drive.
No, they're able to, prior they would have had to walk along the roadway. Now that the bridge is wider, there's more space in between, so they create kind of these pathways. So the wildlife would still be moving on the same grade as the road. The road still runs in the middle of it, and then the wildlife has just more space to not be on the roadway and move under the bridge to its 2 sides.
Okay.
I really liked how you split up the behavioral state and kind of ran the movement ones independently. I'm curious if you used, like, did you do any kind of resource selection analysis on the other behavioral states, and did that inform, like, maybe they're moving to somewhere they would prefer, or did that affect their crossing?
I would really like to look into that. But the in my role, and I think the Resource Commission, and these are questions Dr. Chakowski and I talk about, because there's so many more questions to ask. That movement piece is kind of mine and what we were slated for. As far as like a larger habitat management, I really want to ask those questions, but that habitat management or habitat selection on a larger scale is a little bit more in the state agency's wheelhouse. And I think we might all work together to work on that. Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to see how the resource differences are. I imagine the foraging would be very heavy herbaceous vegetation. Maybe some sugar. Yeah.
And along those lines, as there's hopefully more projects that are gonna happen on both sides of I-40 there with some thinning and burning
Yeah.
projects. I'm curious how that would shift their movement, because right now, obviously, they're moving from very, human-centric
Yes.
wild areas where they're, or not wild areas, but herbaceous heavy areas.
Mhm.
So once you have more woodland communities established on both sides, would that impact elk movement? In some areas, I guess it wouldn't with the steep slopes and the rocky areas. But
I think that, so just that whole management area is essentially all here. And you could Google the 12-mile project, Pisgah National Forest. And I think it will absolutely draw them. So even in our, let me go back, sorry. behind this map, besides highlighting, you know, our road segments and the color they are and the priority, the potential movement flow of elk, you can see where these lighter color areas are where elk pathways likely would be, and that's mostly again because of slope. But given, you know, we had elk crossing some structures and they're in this area, there's a small herd that's actually on the other side of the road. There is, I imagine, any sort of these major forest improvement, habitat improvement they're doing for elk in this whole area would absolutely draw the elk, and I see it as our biggest card to maybe get a true wildlife overpass in the area. I think it's going to be really important for the population, but I think it will absolutely draw them across the road. So I think that's having that in our pocket. When I mentioned that to the state elk biologist, that's been in the works forever, and so it's been off the radar. But I've recently heard I think there was some pushback against it, and now they're free to move forward with this 12-mile project in Pisgah. So I think it is going to be a huge factor. To me, it's going to be this big one to maybe push folks over the line to really invest in a crossing structure.
So right now, like just based on your data, you could, you know, if the money was there,
Yeah,
put two bridges, one at the top, close to Tennessee, and the other one, or in Tennessee, I guess. And
yeah,
the other one further down the bottom, right?
yep.
And with one of those, with the bottom bridge in North Carolina, would that, if you were want to suggest one based on this data, would that line up with the 12-mile project addition?
Yeah, that's what's really wild is this area, this kind of tan area highlighted here. This is a lake here. It's being blocked out because they have little shallow slopes. This is also where for the North Carolina, this is where we're really pushing to get at mitigation. Our 4 top priority areas are there. There, as well as this is where of the 11 road segment hotspots in North Carolina, 7 of them exist in this area. And this is also where that 12-mile project is going to happen on both sides of the road here. So this is really where we're trying to focus. Again, we've had to kind of move backwards. I think we put the DOT on the spot by our large recommendations. One of our big ones is there's a double tunnel that's kind of used as unfortunately, it's where the landscape gets crazy, but the interstate tunnels under the road. And so there's a large landmass. It's almost like a wildlife overpass. It's very rugged. But there's also a single tunnel in one of our biggest hotspots. And we're just really pushing that they maybe put a wildlife overpass over one lane. I think that would be cheaper, but any talk of a large structure has folks pretty freaked out. But we have experts, you know, that can identify funding and match funds. And so that's really the angle. And it's been interesting to see how our policy folks behind the scenes and talking to politicians and legislators really do have a lot of power and can kind of get these things elevated a bit more. And we're just trying to be ready for when that minute happens. And we think we have the research that's going to support that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned earlier about the vehicle collisions with black bear and deer as well. So I was curious if you're using this in concert with other data associated with those species to develop like more of a coexisting structure or bridge crossing. It's also looking at those like high traffic areas by those other species.
Yes, what's really nice is currently because of I guess just with this project, being NGOs, like we plug out this project all the time. I've been on like documentaries and all kinds of stuff. And with the kind of, you know, notoriety it's gotten, then that led to some dedicated funding from the University of Tennessee to do a bear GPS project, collaring project in the same area. And she's also with Dr. Drew Clark, and she'll be in her 2nd year doing bear, looking at where bears are crossing. And really, surprisingly enough, from what she's shown so far, our camera data and our vehicle collision data and our monitoring of those structures are all lining up together, which is really nice. Yes.
So I was aware of these overpasses and underpasses, so I'm not really familiar with like the effects of them. Are there ever any instances of predators targeting these overpasses and underpasses as like a bottleneck of prey that has, or maybe not for elk, but.
Right. You know, that's kind of the first thing a lot of folks think about, and I feel like, you know, that might have gotten pushed before, and I think I was considering that, and there could be an anecdotal, you know, account of that, but really no research identifying that these provide, you know, hunters for, you know, sitting predators, just waiting for something to come through. I don't think it works that way. But I suppose, you know, the elk population in North Carolina is not hunted currently. But I could see potentially how maybe a human hunter could set up, but they don't seem to be this like the gates open and a flood of prey. But yeah, I mean, I think it is something to consider, but it just doesn't seem to be out there. But I do think folks, it's kind of gotten through maybe socially, that folks think that that's maybe a drawback, but literature doesn't really seem to be there.
Can you speak a bit about public perceptions of one, elk populations in this area and potentially increasing them, and two, installing overpasses to decrease animal vehicle collisions?
In this area, or just
Both in this area and in general?
yeah. As far as yeah, it's a hard take, and I'd almost have to, you know, lean on the state elk biologist. Through time, I think, and so I've worked with an elk population in Virginia as well now on a road project. They seem to be through time early on. Interestingly enough, as the elk moved out of the park, the folks that lived, and generations lived in the park got moved out of the park too, right, when it got established. And it's interesting that when the elk moved out, they kind of moved out onto these folks' properties. Elk like these open areas, and they like to mess with folks' fruit trees and all kinds of, you know, stuff in Appalachia that, you know, you'd have. And so there was a really big elk conflict for, I would say, the first 10 years. I'm sure it's still going on, where the state got funding from the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, but had to put up fencing for folks to exclude elk. But I would say now, they've turned into a really important economic driver of tourism for some of these areas, like Maggie Valley, outside the park. Of course, you know, folks don't really know the North Carolina side of the park as much, but it has really increased tourism. So, it's hard to say with the mix of folks living out there. I think folks that have kind of been there, maybe even Cherokee natives, you know, not feeling too connected to the elk population. But I think for the other influx of folks coming in, I think they're a positive and draw folks out and money into the economy. I think, you know, in Virginia, in the work I've been doing in Virginia, GPS elk, a big push for a crossing for those animals is because they are hunted. And the 4 tags they generated this last year was almost $500,000. And so I think they kind of have a bit of an ecosystem service, or, you know, at least some service there. I'd be interested, and I'm interested to work with Dr. Chakowski to find out, you know, what the temperature would be on elk in South Carolina.
What about overpasses in general as wildlife corridors? Is that something that's really positively viewed by the guardian public?
I think the majority of public, yeah, I think they like those things. I think they're a happy story, and with social media, folks are seeing these everywhere. And I think we will get there. I think they're kind of a win-win. But I don't think the DOTers or the state agency, like folks I talk to about this, think it's the coolest thing ever and how great. I think we're behind, and that's what a lot of this work is doing, is trying to build, you know, that these are true solutions, and they're working out west. I mean, I wish I would have provided some better details on the type of, for instance, in Virginia, a couple already structures, one that moves a vehicle, one that moves cars, one that's a hydraulic culvert moving water. You know, they fenced those, they made them excluded wildlife from the road. And, you know, in Virginia and I-64, it decreased white-tailed deer vehicle collisions by like 100% in those spots. But there's going to be a lot more work to do, I think, to get folks on board. Just again, the cost. The cost is a really big thing. Some of the other work I'm doing though is on some smaller structures, some dedicated structures. And has anybody been to Gorgeous State Park? I mean, it's wild, right? Monitoring some small timber rattlesnake, eastern box turtle structures. Gorgeous State Park put in for their visitor center when they were creating that road. Small little culverts, and was surprised this last summer monitoring them when they were putting in 2009. Just monitored them and the diversity of wildlife using these small 2 meter by 2 meter opening culverts. Timber rattlesnakes, a diversity of snakes, a bunch of small mammals. So my big push now is to at least get folks to coalesce around these smaller structures that when roadways are being constructed, it's a drop in the bucket. And that's where we see a lot. Usually have your best opportunity to do these large road projects when there's already some, like if a road's being widened or there's already stuff going on out there as far as road projects. So finding that right timing, and that's why, these bridge replacements worked out because those bridges had timed out. So looking for opportunities there. I know that with the new state park, Pisgah State Park outside of Asheville, we're going to be pushing for when they create infrastructure to put in these smaller crossings because they're essentially a concrete culvert. It's filled with dirt and pretty cheap, and they seem to be, for something like a timber rattlesnake, we believe road mortality is #1 issue with population now, and so things like that for these smaller animals. And again, yeah, I don't think salamanders are going to be using what an elk's using. I'll get that thrown back at me sometimes, but there's winners and losers. But I think using some of these animals as a proxy really will help. Connectivity for a lot of animals now that we know how impactful roadways can be.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Last question.
Yeah.
So is there any possibility of a real-time warning system so that we can avoid the drivers that the deer is passing the road in the future?
Yeah. And there's like a diversity of technologies and they're used out west. Sometimes some can be based on cameras and heat detection. They detect an animal and then they throw up lights, or just at certain times of day. And what's interesting is I think people are going to be looking at that more so because to qualify for a lot of this wildlife crossing funding, there needs to be some innovative. They want to see some innovation as far as what you're going to use. And so those are used. I think they have their drawbacks. I think they've been shown to work in some places and not others. But you'd have to be kind of plugged into the grid. That hasn't been proposed here, but in the Virginia study I've been working on, there will be some form of detecting elk near the roadway and having lights.
All right, let's take this.
There you go.
So usually they did all that. Not